Hello there everyone and welcome back to Void War Studios for the last part in our Super Heavy Tank series. At least for now, as the variants of these tanks are the ones that have the most, as up-to-date rules as we currently have. Bless Games Workshop and their slow codex output, but COVID has kind of screwed everyone else over, so maybe we'll be seeing some codexes before the end of the year is out. Or at least more codexes, I should say. Anywho, on to much more enjoyable things. Let us start with our first tank, which has an interesting history, as it is another variant, of course, of the venerable Baneblade, known as the Banehammer. Created specially for the Tyrannic Wars, this was the primary Imperial Guard vehicle that commanders really desperately wanted when hordes of, toothy, unpleasant monsters in the form of the Tyranids were running across open ground, and sometimes you just don't have enough guns to get rid of them before they start murdering your troops, which is surprisingly irritating and tends to have devastating results on morale. In order to combat this, the Imperial Guard commanders decided that a new variant of Baneblade was required. Instead of the standard battle cannon, which, whilst effective, it couldn't remove the smaller creatures quickly enough, a tremor cannon was instead invented. This interesting mortar launches large projectiles high into the air, travelling at some distance, which, when they hit the surface, do not detonate. They travel some distance under the ground, and then a massive explosive shockwave liquefies the ground where the shell impacted, literally sending infantry and vehicles sprawling all over the place, trying desperately to stay upright, otherwise they fall into cavernous holes and, die. Because gravity. This proved to be an incredibly effective vehicle, as the Imperial Guardsmen, whilst having lots and lots of guns, just needed something to remove more of the little gribblies so they could concentrate on the larger creatures. And with its ability to have Imperial Guardsmen hang out inside, giving it a troop capacity of 25 and firing ports for 10 individuals all around the Baneblade, and with the beautiful accompaniment of 2 las cannons, a twin-linked heavy bolter, 2 twin-linked heavy bolters or flamers, it meant that this thing could get fairly close to a Tyranid swarm barreling down the road and actually make it really regret wanting to absorb this biomass. And it also meant that the guardsmen could concentrate their heavier vehicles on, bio-titans or carnifexes or the bigger gribblies. As overkill as it may sound to send a super heavy tank to deal with the smaller creatures, there is a tank we will get to in this video that really is designed for dealing with the smaller things. But the Banehammer is a fantastic variant of the Baneblade, particularly when you know you're going to be swamped and outnumbered, and you want a way to remove chaff units really quickly. However, the tremor cannon is not something you want to try up against Titans, but the Imperial Guard are about to prove that anything with enough improvisation can become a Titan killer, or at least having the capacity to be a Titan killer, but its creation came about in a very odd and unusual way. This variant of tank, created in the Ordana sector after a particularly unpleasant situation where a renegade Forge world decided to, attack it, along with its Titan legions, which is a horrendously horrific kind of thing. This resulted in a 1,000-year siege, which only was won by the barest of margins and required a hell of a lot of improvised weaponry just to counter the legions of the renegade Titans. Because if you hadn't learned from this little super heavy tank series by now, Titans are ridiculously dangerous and you need ridiculous guns to try and stop them. Titan is not something to be dealt with by standard tanks, infantry and aircraft. There is very little the Imperial Guard can do in a one-on-one fight against Titans, unless they are packing a ridiculous amount of long-ranged, heavy artillery with plenty of options to retreat and withdraw, and plenty of smaller tanks to try and keep it distracted. In this case, due to the commander's requests for shadow swords not being met, as the rate of attrition was quite severe, to cut costs and to, increase the production, many Banehammers were outfitted with magma cannons. which are essentially cut-down versions of a volcano cannon that was salvaged from the scrap shadow swords, turning them into Doomhammers, each one being capable of dealing death blows to titans, but they've got to get close enough to use it because, unlike the fantastic range of a volcano cannon, these things are absurdly dangerous to a titan, but it's got to be at close quarters. And there's a little nifty aspect to this, that it has a troop capacity, unlike the other variants we've seen thus far. 25 men and women, men or women I should say, can hide inside this thing and pop their las guns out, or whatever weapon they have at the time, out to the top and start shooting. And whilst you might normally think that getting a bunch of Banehammers and giving them magma cannons, shortening their range and drastically reducing their ability to sneak up on things from long distances and snipe them might be a bit catastrophic, it turned out this actually worked surprisingly well, as the Doomhammer had several factors on its side that hadn't been considered. One, the fact that it didn't have to fire its shells so far meant that it required less energy output, meaning that unlike shadow swords that have to lie in wait and hide and power down everything else except for the capacitors for the volcano cannon, this thing can actually move and fire. A very, very, very helpful trait when you're trying to dodge titan weaponry, or anything in that matter. And the bonus was that because it had a higher rate of fire and could move, it was a much more tactically flexible tank. Due to the nature of the planet they were fighting on, there were an awful lot of hive cities, which meant there was a ridiculous amount of cover, there was plenty of places for the tanks to hide, lots of rubble everywhere, so it meant that the Renegade Titans would have a hard time trying to find these vehicles hidden and camouflaged very, very well amongst the rubble in the buildings. And these things can sit quietly and emit as little energy as possible, then it's entirely possible to lay ambushes for the odd Titan column coming down the road. Because they didn't have to have retrofitted shells for the volcano cannon, it created an awful lot of room inside of the tank, and the ammunition for it was, well, much more straightforward, and the shorter range meant that the power needed was lessened. Because you were firing at something closer, you didn't have to output as much energy to have the same result, meaning that you cut down the energy cost, you gained a little bit of transport capacity, and it also means that your Imperial Guardsmen feel incredibly happy hiding inside of this thing and occasionally popping out a lasgun to, well, fire back. If you can't get a hold of shadow swords, which are the premier Titan killers, Doomhammers will serve you perfectly fine. In enough numbers. And speaking of city and hive battles, where there are oftentimes very little open ground to actually see where your enemy is, and you often need to be able to fire very quickly without having to worry about reloading or, well, you know, seeing necessarily what you're shooting at, there is another variant of this Baneblade type that suits this kind of environment quite well, known lovingly by its enemies as the Hellhammer, which I'd like to think came from the fact that the last thing the enemy gets to mutter to itself as the shell lands gracefully on top of their head is Hell, followed by a hammering explosion. The Hellhammer is a variant of Baneblade designed specifically for these kinds of scenarios, where there is ridiculous amounts of cover, there is very little room to maneuver or time to reload and fire, and it makes the best use of this by having relatively short-range weaponry designed specifically for destroying and laying siege to buildings. It does this with its main armament known as the Hellhammer cannon. A short-range, really high-caliber firing gun fires shells that contain unstable subatomic charges. Yes, which means that these things, when they make impact with enemy armour, explode in miniature nuclear explosions. This is the kind of tank you deploy into a city environment where you really no longer care about collateral damage, or concepts like, I don't know, innocent bystanders, civilians, or anything that might, you know, die from radiation poisoning. All that kind of unimportant stuff. And in case this wasn't bad enough for your unfortunate enemy that you're now firing at, you of course are also armed with coaxial autocannons for that extra rate of fire, the Demolisher Cannon, because screw you fortifications, twin-linked heavy bolters, and las cannons just in case, with twin-linked heavy flamers on its side sponsons just to make absolutely sure that any infantry trying to sneak around the side thoroughly regret their intentions. And, you know, heavy flamers in close quarters and in city-type environments are just all kinds of devastation and evil. And with a transport capacity of 25 Imperial Guardsmen, any sucker who even manages to get around the heavy flamers is going to find a bayonet, or possibly, in the case of Krieger, shovel embedded in their head. And the Hellhammer variant is fantastic in these kinds of scenarios, because with its massive booming Hellhammer cannon combined with the Demolisher, it can devastate buildings and fortifications and bunkers and barracks within seconds, and if anything is unlucky enough to survive, autocannons, heavy flamers and las cannons will finish off anything that even manages to stumble out of the wreckage. I would definitely not recommend it tries going Titan hunting though, as whilst the Hellhammer cannon is a fantastic piece of weaponry against stationary buildings and large armoured vehicles, void shields will be a bit tricky for this thing to crack. Now, obviously, if you have 3 or more Hellhammers, well, now you're talking. We might be able to kill perhaps a Warhound, maybe a Reaver, if we're extremely lucky. But you really need the Shadow Sword or possibly the Doomhammer in large enough quantities to really put a dent in anything larger than a Reaver. And now we move on to our final super heavy tank, of course based on the Baneblade chassis, and this one is kind of fun, in my opinion. This is the first of the Baneblades we've looked at that realistically is a purely troop supporting role, which for a super heavy tank is very bizarre. But it's very difficult to deny this thing's effectiveness, particularly when backed up by Imperial Guard regiments. The Stormlord, a super heavy main battle tank variant of the Shadow Sword. This thing has replaced the sniping volcano cannon with a Vulcan mega bolter. Just for clarification, this is the thing that hangs quite comfortably on a Warhound Titan's arm. Yeah, this thing is an anti-infantry support vehicle in the extreme. It's capable of ripping to shreds light vehicles with the Vulcan mega bolter because the Vulcan mega bolter is frankly a ridiculous piece of machinery. This thing's absolutely staggering rate of fire means that it literally does shred vehicles to small pieces. Even small structures without too much armour on are going to get shredded with this type of weapon. Its primary usage is, of course, to mow down lightly armoured tanks, vehicles, and infantry that are in the way of any advancing elements. This thing can carve pathways through greenskins, tyranids, demons, doesn't matter. It will be shredded into tiny, tiny pieces if it stays in front of this thing for any length of time. No vehicle in the Astra Militarum's current book of super heavy tanks has a greater transport capacity, as the Stormlord will quite happily and comfortably fit 40 guardsmen inside. Imagine the surprise on a more heavily armoured vehicle's face when it comes charging towards this thing, thinking, haha, it's only got 2 las cannons, I'll be fine. And then out pops 10 heavy weapon teams, each armed with a las cannon. Oh, the surprise on that poor individual's face. And of course, it makes a wonderful snug bunker for say, a large group of Ogrins to be deployed right in the thick of the fight. Or anything else you desire, of course. And that is quite simply because when you remove that annoying volcano cannon, you remove an awful lot of the power generators and capacitors that kept the thing from, well, exploding inside of the tank. Meaning that whilst you had to make some room for a ridiculous amount of bullets, as not only does this thing have the Vulcan Mega Bolter, of course, it also has the standard armament of twin-linked heavy bolters, because it didn't have enough, 2 sponson-mounted las cannons, and 2 sponson-mounted heavy flamers. And if you want to be extra ridiculous, you can remove the heavy flamers and have additional twin-linked heavy bolters. Whilst it's not going to be moving very fast, and it's not necessarily very manoeuvrable, like all Baneblade variants, this thing is absolutely going to shred large hordes of infantry, and it has made its presence fully known in multiple engagements and is loved by Imperial Guard regiments all over, because when they walk behind this thing, they know they are not in front of it, where all that beautiful bolter fire is going off. Definitely a vehicle you keep the hell away from Titans, because utterly useless. Well, that's a lie. It's not utterly useless, but it's a bit like... It's kind of like a bunch of bees trying to sting a honey badger, because those videos exist on YouTube. You will know for a fact that the honey badger will be annoyed, it will be stung repeatedly, but it will just shred the beehive to smithereens because it can just out-muscle you. That is why the Stormlord should be kept firmly away from anything with heavy armour. Vulcan Megabolter has a chance of piercing it. It's much happier shredding any infantry that decide to get too close. And I think that's probably why I love this variant. It is literally designed to help the humble guardsman not have to get charged by hordes and hordes of hungry, terrifying entities of mankind. And that is the end of our Super Heavy Tank series, at least for now. All the variants that I've discussed are still available for you to play on the tabletop, so hopefully the little advice that I've given will help you know how best to use them in-game. Anyway, what is your favourite Baneblade variant? Put it in the comment section below and let's talk about it. Thank you all very much for listening. I hope you're having a great day wherever you are, and until next time, take care everyone.